Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to weekly classroom session 11 of the International Diploma Course on Diplomacy, Strategy and Foreign Policy, organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. As we enter the closing phase of this academic program, we're engaging with themes that are central to understanding how states navigate a rapidly changing international environment. Today's session focuses on India's foreign policy, key priorities in a multipolar world. We meet at a moment in which the global geopolitical environment is tense, eventful, and visibly in transition. The so-called rules-based international order, once largely shaped and defended by its principal architects, now finds itself under scrutiny and selective contestation, including from the very actors that once championed it. A more fragmented and competitive system is emerging, marked by shifting alignments, revived great power rivalry, and the growing agency of regional players. For India, operating within this evolving landscape requires clarity of interests and flexibility of instruments, whether in security, connectivity, technology, climate diplomacy, or global governance. Understanding India's foreign policy priorities, therefore, also requires situating them within the broader dynamics of multipolarity, issue-based coalitions, and the diffusion of power across regions and institutions. We are joined today by Ambassador Gurjit Singh, former Ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, Ethiopia, ASEAN, and the African Union, whose diplomatic experience across diverse geographies offers valuable insights into the contemporary challenges and opportunities shaping India's external engagements. Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh, for being here. It is my pleasure to once again welcome you to the Tillotoma Foundation. As always, I encourage you to share your questions during the session. We will have an interactive discussion following the lecture. With that, it is my great pleasure to invite Ambassador Gurjit Singh to begin today's session. Over to you, Ambassador Singh.
Thank you so much, Kamakshi. And a very good evening to all you young people. I'm very happy to be among you. So I'm supposed to speak on Indian foreign policy priorities in a multipolar world. Normally, when I'm asked to speak somewhere, I rely back on my master's program in JNU in 1977. And I look back at what I was taught and use that as a basis to talk. But I remember that when we had Indian foreign policy and we had a test, my professor was a person called Pushpesh Pant, who's now more famous for writing food books than foreign policy. But he was our Indian foreign policy tutor. And I remember that the question paper that we got was perhaps the most amusing one I had ever seen in my life. For instance, he quoted Faiz and said, जाने कितनी बरसातों के बाद धुलेंगे ये खून के धब्बे, and in this context explained India-Pakistan relations. Similarly, he said, मेरा जूता है जापानी, सर पे लाल टोपी, रूसवा सर पे लाल टोपी, रूसी फिर भी दिल है हिंदुस्तानी, right? And he said, in the context of this, explain India's non-alignment. So this sounds a bit foolish, right? But to be honest, when you think of the world today, if it was not so concerning, it would also be so amusing. Because every day you hear something so unusual that you wonder, is it true? Or is it a meme? Or is it somebody inventing it? So I think back on that question paper and say we need to find answers to silly questions with great seriousness. And I think that is what brings us today. Indian foreign policy traditionally, since let us say 1946, when Prime Minister Nehru, actually he was not Prime Minister then, he was the Vice President of the Interim Council. And he gave a speech on Indian foreign policy on the radio, in which he introduced the term non-alignment for the first time. Subsequently, non-alignment came into the Afro-Asian context at the Bandung Conference in 1955, which is 70 years ago. And slowly it evolved into the non-aligned movement. Now, I want to explain here the difference between non-alignment as a policy and non-alignment as a movement. Non-alignment as a policy is today what we can call strategic autonomy. It is basically every country taking a decision in their own national interest without joining any alliance. In 1946, from 1945, the Cold War had begun, and slowly NATO had come about, and then the Warsaw Pact came about, and the Americans had SEATO and CENTO in Asia. SEATO was the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. CENTO was the Central Treaty Organization. So India avoided all that and had non-alignment as a policy. At that time, India had joined hands with 5 countries around the Bay of Bengal. These were Ceylon, today called Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Burma, today called Myanmar, and Pakistan. Pakistan because of East Pakistan. And we 5 were called the Colombo Powers. And we evolved the principles of the Bandung Conference, Afro-Asian Conference, which ultimately became the non-aligned movement. Now, out of all these countries, it is only Pakistan which joined CENTO and therefore abandoned non-alignment. All others were patently non-aligned for a very long time. Now, non-alignment as a movement meant you joined a conference, an institution where you passed resolutions, and therefore you were expected to abide by those resolutions, whereas non-alignment as a policy gave you more autonomy to do things by yourself. But by the time African countries were decolonized, mainly from 1956 onwards, they came out, especially in the 1960s, and they had 3 identity cards. The first identity card was a membership of the Organization of African Unity, which was formed in 1963. The second was a membership of the non-aligned movement, which was formed in 1961. And third, consequently, was a membership of the United Nations. So for the newly sovereign, newly decolonized countries, these were elements of statehood, and the non-aligned movement contributed to that. So that is the difference between non-alignment as a policy and non-alignment as a... Now, bipolarity reigned in the context of which non-alignment was relevant. But once the Cold War ended, the Russian the Soviet Union collapsed, you basically ended up with a unipolar world in which America was the sole power. Today, the US is challenged partly by Russia, but mainly by China. That is why Donald Trump in November last year, before meeting Xi Jinping, said the G2 is meeting now, meaning that China and US will decide for the world how things will run. China, of course, did not follow that, but essentially these 2 countries are trying to tell all the others how to behave. In this context, multipolarity becomes all the more important, because if you want to be strategically autonomous, then doing so in a bipolar world is more difficult, especially because unlike 1961, today trade is far more globalized, supply chains are far more existing, and you are dependent on others for your export and import and for technology and mobility of your people, which in 61 was not so. So today, globalization, which is today in retreat, has led you into a multipolarity which is important for you. Multipolarity also allows us to create a more equal world order, a rules-based order, which today is also being pushed. So therefore, multipolarity means that there is no dominant power, rules obtain, and India, EU, ASEAN, Africa, Latin America, everybody has a say. and the Americans and the Chinese should not be able to do what they want. But in this, India has typically cultivated Europe to build an alternative medium powers multipolarity. Ever since the Modi government came, Europe has been extremely important to us. And in the month of January 2026, you saw German Chancellor here. Now you will see the EU leadership come, a Republic Day chief guest. In between, we had, I think, the Dutch and the Polish foreign ministers. And you will soon have the French president here for the Global AI Summit, for which many other European leaders will come. So Global AI Summit will also be a part of multipolarity and setting a rules-based order. Now, in this background and the disruption caused by Donald Trump's daily dose of invective and surprise means that we have to be far more nimble-footed and dynamic than ever before. So therefore, let us take the first aspect of India's foreign policy priorities in a multipolar world. I would say strategic autonomy today is our core doctrine. If we succeed in it, it will allow us to preserve decision-making independence while engaging with flexibility with competing power blocs. Fairly straightforward. Non-alignment we don't talk about. We talk about strategic autonomy, which means that we are not part of an American alliance. The Indo-Soviet treaty does not mean that much, and certainly China is not our friend. So we are treating every issue on merit or on national interest. A lot of people say morality demands this, morality demands that, but in foreign policy there is no place for morality, least of all today, because today the issue-based, value-based order is also put on the side. So today you have to have hard-nosed national interest. And therefore questions like, should we take the American invitation to join the Gaza global invitation to the, what is it called, some kind of a executive board or something. No, this is not a value-based approach, it is a transactional approach. So the reason India has not responded so far, whereas Canada and France have said no and many others are hedging, is because we want to take an autonomous decision in our national interest. What will we gain by joining that? What will we lose by joining that? That is how today decisions are taken, and therefore you cannot simply say India is always on the side of the Palestinians, because today India-Israel relations are extremely important in the context of technology, defense, counter-terror and things like that. So even if the Israelis are doing bad things in Palestine, we find it difficult to condemn them because our national interest says we need them with us, whereas morality says we should support Palestine. This is the dichotomy, but dichotomy is accentuated by the rising bipolarity, weakening multipolarity, in which while we want multipolar world, we also want to engage with the big powers, preferably at our own terms, but not always possible. So strategic autonomy means sometimes doing nothing, sometimes doing little, and sometimes doing a lot, but doing it always without ideology, but in national interest. So we can build on this idea as we go along. The second core aspect of this is balancing major powers. We have to be dynamic. We have to manage complex ties with the US, China, Russia, and the EU without formal alliances or relying on precedent. You can't say, oh, Europe and us decided this in 2007, so we must continue to do so. The world is not the same. Today, Europe, while talking trade, wants to include the cross-border climate issues on trade, which was not there in 2000s. The Americans, with whom we have a good relation for 25 years, don't think we have enough value for them unless we do things for them, particularly opening our markets to their products, particularly agricultural products. The Russian relationship has become much more transactional, and while we do keep saying, oh, we are long-standing friends, the reality is that our trade is very small other than oil, and we are buying oil not because we love Russia, but because we are getting a good deal. It's in our national interest. With China, we tried very hard to manage the relationship But in 2020, they upset the bandwagon by attacking us in Ladakh and Galwan, which made us now force us to take different positions which otherwise we would have not taken had that attack not. So you are not in control of your relationship with these four big entities, but we try to be in better control of other global South partnerships like ASEAN, like the South Pacific, like Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. So those are the kind of balances that we try to do. Mr. Jaishankar in his book has often said that India's challenge will remain working with the US, managing China, keeping Russia on even keel, and developing relationship with EU. Now these are like juggling balls. You have to keep them in the air, making sure not one of them falls, because whichever falls will hurt you. So you have to keep juggling them like this and dealing with them. But sometimes the ball has its own battery, like Trump in US, Russia invading Ukraine. Russia invading Ukraine was the most devastating thing for India's strategic autonomy, because now we are being forced to take sides, which we don't want to take. Third aspect I think that we should look at is the neighborhood first policy, prioritizing stability and connectivity across South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. Now, neighborhood first makes sense because all our neighbors have a common border with India or a sea boundary like Sri Lanka and Maldives. They have nothing else common among them. Only Bhutan. I don't think anybody has a common boundary. Afghanistan and Pakistan do, yes. So of the SAARC 8 countries, we are the core. So we try to maintain a good relationship with all our neighbors and offer them a partnership in our prosperity. Meaning we offer you trade concessions, offer market access, we put lot of money in your system. Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, Afghanistan have all seen very large amounts of Indian funds funding their development and bailing them out of crisis. You may remember that Prime Minister Modi was sworn in for the first time in 2014. He invited the leaders of all our neighboring countries to his swearing in, and all other 7 countries came: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Bhutan and Nepal. The interesting thing was that at that time, all the leaders who came were elected leaders. Even Afghanistan, Pakistan, all had elected leaders. Today, if you were to call the same group, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, not all had upheaval, no properly elected leaders. So democracy has regressed in South Asia. At the same time, since 2014, India has pumped in more money and provided much more development assistance to our neighbors other than Pakistan than ever before. But yet, while neighborhood is first for us, for most of our neighbors, we are not the first option. They believe that China, America, others are their first option, particularly China, because it is willing to put in a lot of money. But there are 3 aspects here that we must remember. I think China with Nepal and Bhutan and to an extent Myanmar has a common border. But with all the others, it has no common border. So it's a distant neighbor. They are ready to put in a lot of money. But when it comes to crisis, like Bangladesh had a crisis, Sri Lanka had a serious crisis, Maldives had a crisis, there was no Chinese money coming to bail them out. It was all Indian money, stabilizing Maldives, stabilizing thing. And today we are not helping Bangladesh so much, but we have not cut off our relations with Bangladesh, which we cultivated in the previous regime. For instance, power, oil, diesel still flows. We have not stopped all this, though they are not paying the bills. The third aspect is that India wants our neighbors to give priority to India in the sense that do not jeopardize our security. Do not give shelter to anti-Indian elements. And secondly, do not do anything which will threaten our security, and also give a level playing field to Indian business interests for projects in their countries. After all, if we are funding them so much, We also need some business to be developed. After that, if they want to build a relationship with China, buy Chinese weapons, deal with America, do whatever, it is not of prime importance. Please remember that under Sheikh Hasina, Bangladesh was an ideal neighbor on all these terms. But Bangladesh was buying all its weapons from China. But we never objected because they were meeting the other criteria of friendship with India. Today, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh are not following that neighborhood first criteria with us. So we have problems with them. But while you may wish away that, okay, I don't want relationship with Bolivia or Peru, you can't wish away your neighbors. So we have to be patient as the elder brother, and we have to keep undertaking relationships, helping them in crisis, because ultimately it is the people of these countries who will remain pro-Indian, while governments may keep changing their policies. So neighborhood first means a lot of people-to-people contact. You know, when Afghanistan Taliban came, or in Bangladesh the upheaval came, one of the first things we restarted was medical visas. People wanting to come to India for medical treatment. That goes a very long way in, touching the nerve among the people. Now you see the logic in Afghanistan. Though Pakistan is their neighbor and their mentor, they are at war with Pakistan, but Taliban wants to make up with India. President Muizzu in Maldives was so anti-Indian, but today he is your, if not a friend, at least a balanced neighbor. The same with Anura Dissanayake in Sri Lanka. His party, by its constitution, is anti-Indian. But now they realize that without India, there is no hope. So India, while it seems that we are losing our neighborhood first perspective, I put it to you that Afghanistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka are prime examples of the success of the neighborhood policies when faced with adverse people coming to power over them. Therefore, I believe that after elections in Nepal, in Myanmar and in Bangladesh, similar opportunities may arise. May not be all easy, Bangladesh may not be so easy, but it's a matter of time and patience. We should not lose patience. We should not take precipitate steps. And that is the strategic autonomy we adopt with our neighborhood, and we prioritize stability and connectivity across South Asia. I don't know how many of you know this, but Bangladesh for long had wanted to buy power through transmission connectivity from Nepal and Bhutan. During the monsoon months, there is surplus power in these two countries. All the power plants there are built by India. India buys all the power. But there is some surplus. So India has for the first time allowed Bangladesh in the low season to import that power. And you know when this decision was announced? After Muhammad Yunus took over. So it was already prepared. But we did not stop it. That is what I meant by saying prioritizing stability and connectivity, come what may. Of course, if there is, terrorists coming through the borders, we will stop it, the coming of, going of people. But we have not stopped the supply of power, coal, petroleum, and other things to Bangladesh, even in these dire circumstances. Now let me move to number 4, Indo-Pacific engagement. Strengthening the Quad and ASEAN partnerships to uphold a free, open, and rules-based maritime order. Now, typically in this area, the term used was Asia Pacific. And Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, is a very big institution set up in 1989, but it excluded India. So in the Asia Pacific concept, India was not included. Asia stopped with Myanmar, but Pacific went up to the US, Mexico, and the Pacific front countries of Latin America. India was not. But since we had the Look East policy and now the Act East policy, we were engaging with ASEAN. And since 1992, we have a sectoral relationship, 1996 a dialogue partnership, and 2002 a summit relationship, 2023 onward, comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN. Now, ASEAN saw the value of bringing in India as a partner, so they admitted us into the East Asia Summit in 2005 to balance China. Now, China is ASEAN's biggest trading partner and it dominates them strategically. But ASEAN doesn't like that. They cannot resist it, but they don't like it. So, India is their go-to balancing power. In the surveys carried out in ASEAN, India is seen as a major balancing power, though that is not a role India looks for itself, because we don't think we are a real balance to China. But when China started threatening ASEAN's security by taking over everything within the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, at that time the Indo-Pacific concept came out, first between India and Japan, then India and the US, and finally India, US, Japan and Australia, and that became the Quad. The Quad countries are all members of the East Asia Summit, but they are more important in the Indo-Pacific because East Asia Summit originally dealt with the Asia Pacific because of Chinese hegemonic design. That is the turning point, 2012. So, since 2012, the term Indo-Pacific has become more important, in which India is the core, and India, Japan, France are Indo-Pacific policies go right up to Africa. The Americans, Australians stop in India and then go towards the Pacific. So it is basically the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean combined, but the focal area is from the Bay of Bengal to Japan and the Western Pacific. Now, the Indo-Pacific is important to India, Japan, Australia. The Americans come and go. When Obama was there, he said, I will pivot to Asia. It never happened. When Biden came, for the first few months, they just ignored the Indo-Pacific. But then they became stridently pro-Indo-Pacific and they raised the Quad to a summit and held several summits. Donald Trump, when he got sworn in, on the very first day, Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State, held a meeting with the Quad foreign minister. So Quad was given very high prominence at that stage, but he has not come to India to participate in the Quad summit. So what is happening with the Quad is there is no summit, but Quad is continuing. But all the Quad partners are anxious about what the US will do. But the Indo-Pacific is our area, no? India, Japan, Australia. So I have been saying that India, Japan, Australia must do more together in the region, whether the Americans participate regularly or not. So I think that is the way to go. We need to shoulder more responsibility, and we don't have to be dependent on the United States to decide what Indo-Pacific policies we follow. It is difficult to say we'll carry on the Quad without Donald Trump. That has bilateral consequences. But Indo-Pacific, certainly we can continue and work together, and I think we are doing that. If you saw the Japanese foreign minister who came last week, you look at his joint statement and look at the India-Australia comprehensive economic partnership. So things are looking up and looking better. So Indo-Pacific engagement and ASEAN partnership is important. We also need to develop ASEAN partnership beyond looking at China. If you look behind me, you will see the cover of my new book, Mango Flavor, which is actually about India, ASEAN and the Act East policy. And here I've tried to explain that both sides keep thinking about China while dealing with each other. But our relationship will get better if we stop thinking of China and just did things together which are functional and good for our people. Now I'm going to move to number 5. Global South leadership, positioning India as a credible voice on development finance, debt relief, climate justice and food security. During the 2023 presidency of the G20, India heavily lent on the Global South perspective. We held 2 Voice of Global South summits, and in 2024 we did another one, third Global Voice. So we also brought the Global South agenda onto the G20, which South Africa and Brazil carried on, but we don't know what will happen under the US chairmanship of the G20, but that agenda is important to us. Now, Global South is again like non-alignment equals to strategic autonomy plus Global South. in broad. It's not a real equation, but I would look at it like that. So Global South again gives you all the development aspects, including modern issues like critical minerals, just transition, solar, climate justice, which were not issues in 1961, but you do them on a strategic autonomous basis. That is where Global South comes in. India's credibility for Global South actually comes from our development cooperation. So in my previous book on Harambe Factor, India and Africa Economic and Development Cooperation, I detailed what all India does with Africa for development cooperation. India's development cooperation started in 1949 by supporting Indonesia and Myanmar. I told you about the Colombo Power, right? And in 1956 onwards, we were started doing it with Sudan, Ethiopia, who were the independent countries at that time. But from 1964, when the ITEC program was launched, India Technical and Economic Cooperation Program, the flagship India Development Cooperation Program, $1 billion program, widely understood in the developing world. In surveys that I did for Mango Flavor and Harambe Factor, people in Africa and ASEAN said, what Indian brand do you remember the most? The majority said ITEC program. It is a very successful development cooperation program. It is India's success in development cooperation which helps build local capacities, transfers technologies, and contributes to local development plans, which makes India such a worthy development partner that most countries in Africa, though they get more from China, believe that India is the model they must emulate because they don't want to be China, even though they get more money. It is this success of India's development cooperation which was accentuated during the COVID pandemic when we gave vaccines all over. That gives strength to our Global South credentials. Some people ask, is China not Global South? China goes around saying we are Global South, Global South, Global South. I think China is not Global South. First, China was never a member of the non-aligned movement. In 1964, when the G77 was formed, the group of 77 for development and trade issues, China never joined the group but associated. So till today, the group is called G77 in China, whereas India is a member, China is not. And secondly, India has no neo-colonial experience. Our development cooperation is benign, whereas China's BRI is a neo-colonial. So after the decolonization from Europe, today people think they need to decolonize from China because these are resource-based, extractive, transactional relationships which put in money but don't build anything for Africa in terms of their human capital. So on these bases, I believe China is not a true Global South country. Next, technology sovereignty. Now in 1961, this was not an issue. Today, it is almost a prime issue because protecting strategic interests in semiconductors, AI, digital public infrastructure and cyber security are all very important. You know that India is hosting the AI summit next month. Why is India doing this? Because from being a rule taker, India wants to become a rule maker. When the internet was formed, there was a private American body which set the internet rules and we all had to follow them. But today with AI and many other things, semiconductors, India wants to be part of the rule-making structure. Now it is like even on climate, India wants to be there. India does not want to be left in a corner so that we can fight for our rights, get development finance to develop, and in the case of AI, get a lot of foreign investment to develop AI in India, given India's technological base. The Americans may not want to be a part of all this, but India is trying to create sufficient multipolar heft so that some rules-based order is created in which India is part of the rule-making and not the recipient of rules. Digital public infrastructure, India is a leader and many countries look up to it. Number 8, I would say climate and energy diplomacy. Now, on climate for many years, India was the outlier. We were little Jack Horner sitting in the corner. But since 2015, we have become center stage and we have announced ambitious targets which we are fulfilling. Without curtailing our thermal energy, we are expanding our solar and other renewable energy. So today we have become a leading player of solar and other renewable energy in the world. Countries like Germany see us as a great partner for global sustainability. And as you know, Germany announced a 10 billion euro sustainability partnership with India, which they will replicate in other developing countries as well, under triangular cooperation. India launched the International Solar Alliance, the Biofuel Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Risk Infrastructure, and other such things. So all these are part of India trying to become a part of the narrative that the world needs to be better governed through cooperation and uniform rules which are just and equitable and not one-sided. Now, certainly, the withdrawal of the United States from the climate negotiations, from the International Solar Alliance, all that is not good. But we are not giving up our agenda. If you saw the text of what India and Germany discussed during the visit of Chancellor Merz, climate is still very high on the agenda. So we are not giving up, even if the US doesn't want to come. Number 9, I would say security and counter-terrorism cooperation. Deepening defense partnerships and intelligence sharing to combat cross-border threats. So terrorism is a big problem, particularly from Pakistan, but also from Central Asia, Bangladesh, from the sea. So these are called non-traditional threats. Non-traditional threats are terrorism, money laundering, drug running, illegal migration, and things like that. India wants to be cooperative with many countries to counter these, because these are not war, but these are grey zone tactics which are worse than war. And this is what China is doing in South China Sea. They are troubling the ASEAN countries through such tactics. Illegal fishing, coming into their exclusive economic zone, but not declaring war. So we all thought that non-traditional threats will now need to be tackled, but with Russia invading Ukraine and Israel attacking Gaza and the numerous wars going on in Africa and now in Thailand, Cambodia, this means that traditional war is back on the table. Now for that, and you had Operation Sindhu, so India needs to substantially increase its defense budget in real terms to augment its defense capabilities, particularly going the Atmanirbhar way. We must have technology transfers and joint production in India like the Russians used to do. We cannot just keep buying Rafales and Apaches from France and the US without any transfer of technology or production in India. That is the problem. They want us to diversify, but they will not give you the same prices or the technology transfer that the Russians always do. So, sticking with Russia for many of our defense deals, though it has really come down, is still in our strategic interest, and not build your dependence on the West alone, because they can switch it off anytime they want. So terrorism and defense are two important things. India's defense industry is slowly looking up. We have positive signs that our defense exports can look up. The BrahMos has been exported to Philippines, Akash, Pinaka rockets, and many other weaponry to Armenia, for instance, and some to African countries. I think we should keep pursuing this and meanwhile strengthen our own defense. The most important thing is to strengthen the Navy, because the Indian Ocean is the greatest source of threat. The Chinese Navy is heading to almost 400 naval vessels, bigger than the United States. The Chinese Navy building its 4th aircraft carrier and setting up bases in Gwadar in Pakistan, Djibouti in Africa, and in Cambodia. So India, though by sea is far from China, it is still a big threat. You keep hearing of the spy ships in Andamans coming to Sri Lanka and all that. So we need to pay much more attention to our Navy and develop our bases in Andamans to become far more potent. My last point is reforming global governance. This basically was advocating UN reform, having more fairer multilateral institutions that reflect contemporary power reality. But with Donald Trump in power, this is being upended for the whole world, not only for India. So he doesn't care for the UN. So what UN reform are we looking at? He doesn't care for multipolar, multinational organizations. He's not worried about WHO, WTO, which are important to us. So these kind of bodies can't run unless everybody is on board. This is not Indo-Pacific or coalition for disaster resilience or international solar alliance, which does not need the participation of everybody. But UN bodies need the participation of everybody. And when everybody, especially America, does not participate, they become weak. So in dealing with pandemics, WHO becoming weak. In dealing with trade matters, WTO almost gone. So therefore today everybody is signing an FTA, which is the death knell of WTO. Even India is signing FTA left, right and center, which earlier we didn't do. And today we talk of UN reform, but UN reform of a UN which is diminished. So I'm not even certain it is worth getting into that Security Council on a permanent basis. So these are the primary challenges of India and its principles. We have value-based principles. And in fact, values of India's foreign policy are embedded in the directive principles of state policy in Chapter 4 of the Indian Constitution, which says we must work for world peace and a just international order and such things, which we should continue to do. But we need not do it at the expense of our national interest, which has to be far more narrowly defined. So in a transactional world, every decision that you take should be on the basis of strategic autonomy, meaning I'm not going to keep supporting Russia come what. But at the same time, we should judge what is our national interest and do things accordingly. People said when Venezuela was attacked by the United States, India said nothing. Yes, we felt bad about it, but we have so many problems with the US on trade, on migration, on sanctions, on extra tariffs, that there was no point in criticizing them for Venezuela. For what purpose? When you have so many real problems with it. So that is called the maturing of a transactional, autonomous, but yet policy based on national interest. So with that, I will stop here. And I'll be happy to discuss it with you if you have any questions or comments. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, for your insightful and a very thought-provoking address. I think your reflections on India's priorities in the multipolar world and the practical realities of navigating shifting global alignments, it has given us a lot to think about. And with that, let's now take up some questions. So I want to ask a question. In your remarks, you explained that how non-alignment as a policy is being closer to what we now call strategic autonomy. In today's world of sanctions, tech controls, and supply chain pressure, what does strategic autonomy actually look like in a practice for India?
So strategic autonomy basically means I will decide things for myself and I will not listen to the big powers or Europe and say I'll do it because I'm your ally or your friend. And the next step is I will put the touchstone of national interest and then only make a statement or take a policy decision. So my autonomy is not only value-based but extremely anchored on an understanding of national interest. That is why we don't call it non-alignment, because non-alignment goes back to a Cold War context.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh. My next question is, in your remarks, you made a very useful distinction between non-alignment as a policy and NAM as a movement with resolutions and expectations. So looking back, did NAM sometimes reduce India's freedom of action rather than expand it?
At time in the beginning, in 1961, I think there was a very strong commitment by India, Yugoslavia, and Egypt and Ghana to give leadership to the non-aligned movement. At that time, the movement was still small because many African countries had not yet become independent. In 1964, when we had the second non-aligned summit, now the numbers were growing. So yes, when you have more numbers, you have to debate more. And let's say on Palestine or many such things, you would be by the majority consensus taken into a position which not everybody would always abide by. But in 1967, there was no non-aligned summit. The world had crashed. So even the non-aligned movement could not hold a summit. And then 1971, I think Sri Lanka did, and were done. But in recent years, the non-aligned, nobody wants to do a non-aligned summit, but it is countries like Venezuela, Iran, Azerbaijan who take on the chairmanship to basically tom-tom their bilateral or their own issue. Not worried about the world at large. So the non-alignment has lost. But when you abided by certain things, the expectation was that once you agreed in the summit, then you should abide by that. But many countries did not. They would then again do it by their own national interest, which very often was pressure from the former colonial master or the Americans or the Russians to take particular positions.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh. So we have a question in the chat also. Rajat Hadri is asking, how can India recalibrate its Africa policy to move from seasonal engagement to sustained strategic presence, especially in areas like maritime strategy and capacity building?
India's policy toward Africa is heavily human resource development oriented. In fact, I always used to say when I ran Africa policy that unlike China, who believe that Africa's best resources lie under the ground, India believes that Africa's best resources live upon it. So we deal with the youth. So when you talk of capacity building or development, actually our policy is focused on this. But our policy was also heavily focused on providing soft loans. But that policy has now run its course. So by the time the next India-Africa summit is held later this year, I think we'll need to craft a new Africa policy, which will provide development finance, but perhaps through the private sector and indirect rather than direct. Because even African countries don't want to borrow money anymore. They want PPP projects or they want investments. So we need to find ways to have hybrid finance, blended finance, de-risking finance to invest in Africa. And secondly, I think slowly we are moving that African countries who are interested should work with Indian educational institutions and allow them to set up campus. There is a National Forensic Studies University in Uganda now. There is an Entrepreneurship Development Institution in Rwanda. There is an IIT Madras in Zanzibar. So these are all locally funded. They're not funded by India anymore. So we believe that those countries who want these institutions to continue should fund them. Out of 25,000 African students in India, actually only 1,000 come on scholarship, 24,000 come on self-finance. So these are good bases to build on and have a education-based HRD capacity building exercise, which should be linked, backwardly integrated to more Indian investment in it and train people who will then be employed over there by Indian companies.
Certainly, yes. Thank you so much. My next question is that if the world is moving towards a contested multipolarity, and like in this, I want to ask, do you think middle powers like India can actually genuinely shape outcomes, or will they mainly be forced into managing great power competition?
It is both. In a rules-based order, we were moving, whether on climate or on health or on solar or on AI and digital, we were moving into the center place to be a rule maker. But the manner in which Russia and China and the Americans are dealing with the world, it is becoming very risky. So what you said, you have to keep managing on a daily basis. All the new problems will keep coming up. But we are not giving up our desire to be a rule maker as part of a rules-based. And that will, if you have a rules-based order, it by nature will be multipolar. So we understand that there is a bipolarity or a tripolarity working. But we need to keep working with Europe, Germany, Japan, Korea, Australia, to keep looking, ASEAN, to keep trying to build order which may be under stress but will survive.
My next question is that when we talk about non-alignment, like non-alignment has historically avoided alliances, but India also needs partnerships for growth and security. So what's that line between autonomy and isolation, and how should India avoid crossing it?
I think once the Cold War ended, that question more or less died out. For instance, India still has the India-Russia Friendship Treaty, but we also have the civilian nuclear arrangement with the United States, and that has been followed with many comprehensive partnerships with the United States. But today, despite all this, can you say the United States is your friend or Russia is your friend? So you can have all kinds of agreements in place. It is your ability to persuade the other that it is in mutual interest to do something. That is where power politics comes. So like we do it with our neighborhood, to tell them, see, it's in your interest to have good relations with us. In the inverse, we also have to tell the Russians and the Americans that it is in your interest to have good relations with us, but they don't always see that interest clearly.
Right, I agree with you. And with that, my next question is basically on multipolarity. So you said that multipolarity is being weakened by rising bipolarity. And if we talk about in practical terms, what indicators tell you the world is sliding back into bipolar competition? And where do you still see genuine multipolar space for India to shape its outcomes?
The last part of your question, I say the same thing I said earlier. India will try to become a part of rule-making bodies and nurture its own multinational bodies like ISA, CDRI, Biofuel Alliance. These are efforts to create multipolar alliances, no? Mm-hmm. But when you ask me where is the evidence that bipolarity is impinging on multipolarity, let us take ASEAN. Now, ASEAN is a neutral place, no? Everybody is supposed to come there. But the Chinese have pulverized them economically and pushed them strategically. And there's nobody coming to their help because they themselves are helpless. Therefore, they look at India, Japan, Australia, to an extent the USA. But ASEAN does not want to talk to the USA because that annoys China. But they don't mind talking to India, Australia, Japan because they feel the Chinese will not be that threatened by them. So this area is one where initially successful multipolarity is really challenged by Chinese hegemonistic design in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Indian Ocean. The same thing is happening in the Indian Ocean where China is raising its footprint. So where earlier India was a dominant power, today China raises the cost of that. Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, Comoros, or Djibouti all want Chinese to be there, so they don't like them. They give you a lot of money, so they'll never refuse the Chinese Navy coming there. When India feels that this Chinese Navy is not threatening those countries but threatening our interests. So you have to learn to coexist. So that is why Djibouti is the clear example. Djibouti had a French base, then they had an American base, then they had a Japanese base, and then they have a very big Chinese base. So they are open to everybody. Now everybody else can keep quarreling, but Djibouti is not quarreling with everybody, just making money out of them all.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh. My next question is that you said in your remarks that disruptions and unpredictability from US politics actually force India to be nimble. Does that mean that India should reduce dependence on US for technology and defense, or double down because China is the bigger threat?
You know, this is not the first time that Indian foreign policy is being challenged to be nimble. In my own lifetime, in 1991, when the Berlin Wall had fallen, Germany had reunited, the Soviet Union was breaking up. That was a very challenging period. And India at that time, please remember, was going through an economic crisis. You know, at that time, to open new embassies in Central Asia and we actually opened the relationship with Israel at that time. That was nimble. But we had to shut embassies in Africa and Latin America to open these embassies because our budget was not increased. We were told, if you have 100 embassies, you have 100 embassies. You can shut some, open some. Under PM Modi, we have opened 18 new embassies in Africa and now in Latin America, and many new consulates in the US and Russia. But then came the Y2K, please remember, 2000. Now that was a challenge. I mean, it was a technological challenge, which was not foreign policy per se, but the first time foreign policy came to realize that technology could upend your systems. So we learned how to deal with it. And then COVID was another big disaster. So we didn't know what to do with COVID, but our development cooperation, which was our foreign policy, they were nimble enough to start e-ITech programs, vaccine programs, all kind of things. So I think being nimble is not difficult. We are used to it. But the problem right now is that while COVID was global and was hitting everybody equally, as was Y2K, but today America, Russia and China are not hitting everybody equally. India as a rising power, attracts disproportionate interest from them to keep us down. Till 5 years ago, the Americans were quite content to work with India in South Asia and to put up as a bulwark against China. Today, Donald Trump thinks he can deal with China himself, or he doesn't need India, and they don't think that India should be the dominant power in South Asia. That will curtail. Therefore, they work with Pakistan, they work with Bangladesh and all. So these are changing. These are meant to be your friends, no? So you are being forced to be nimble. Not that you wanted to be nimble in this way, but after all, we could not prevent what happened to Hasina in Bangladesh. And there it was not the Chinese kicking us out, the Americans kicking us out. So these problems now I think we better understand that don't depend on anybody. Take your own call. And then when it comes to, now you said technology from the USA. No, we want technology from anybody, from Europe, from US. And we will do everything possible to work. The price to pay, we will not be ready to pay in many ways.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Singh. My next question is that you also mentioned about the Galwan incident. You said that the Galwan forced India into positions it wouldn't otherwise take. So do you see a realistic path back to stable engagement with China, or is India now locked into a long-term competition regardless of border de-escalation?
From 1993 till 2020, India had worked with China fairly well on continuing trade, functional relations, while keeping the border dormant. And idea was you don't intrude in each other's things and you manage these. But what happened in 2020 has forced us to bring far many more troops from peacetime location to wartime location. For instance, I think almost 50,000 additional troops are now on the border in Ladakh, and now they're not going back. Earlier you left it and went back, but now you are there. Same thing happening in Arunachal. So new divisions are being raised, and since you have a problem with Pakistan, a two-front war has become a reality now. So you need to spend much more on defense without neglecting the Navy. As I said earlier, we must not forget that that is our biggest threat. They are not a border threat, it's an existential threat. Because the Chinese war in Ladakh cannot stop your trade, but the Indian Ocean can. So after 2020, we have slowly moved to a new normal with China, where the border is live, but we hit back at them on technology, access to India, access to contracts, banning their apps. No, banning apps look silly, no? But it has hurt them badly. They really want that ban on TikTok to be lifted. Because there's so much money to be made out of apps that they realize that this India as the big market is lost to them. At the same time, the Twitter and X and Facebook don't want India to lift the ban on TikTok, but they are reaping the benefits. Now, these are all modern things. In my young days, these were not issues, no? Today, these are the issues. So, we want China to address the trade imbalance. They do nothing to it. They want to come and invest. We said, okay, come and invest, but not in core areas. Not in, you can come and invest in cars, but you cannot hold the majority. So many Chinese investments have sold their majority stake to Indian partners. That model is fine. But India wants to do more because we need to diversify our markets faced with US action. But while we have made overtures towards China, the price that China is demanding from us to take things towards normalcy is very high. It's almost like they say, you bend your knee and then we will talk to you. So they are behaving like a big power, which we cannot agree to. Therefore, I believe keeping up the Russia angle, forcing Russia to buy more from us, improving your exports to ASEAN, Latin America, Africa, all these are extremely important, and now Europe after the FTA, which will help us balance relations between US, China and things. But I think you have to understand that India always said that the 21st century is an Asian century in which India and China can both grow. China believes that the 21st century is a Chinese century in which India is a vassal and not grow at the same pace. That is the essential.
Yeah. So my another question is that India has invested heavily in neighbors through funds, market access, and crisis bailouts. So why do you still see periodic anti-India sentiment in some neighboring states? And what should India change to make its assistance translate into a durable trust?
Indian assistance, believe you me, is a durable asset. Even President Dissanayake, whose JVP party is, from my time in Sri Lanka, I know, very anti-Indian, today said that at time of need, you are a friend indeed, which is not what their picture of India was. The same happens with Maldives. The India out, and then ultimately it had to be India in, India in, India in. So in Bangladesh, we have got $8 billion of loans and very large amounts of investment through private Indian companies. If all this was to withdraw, there would be a crisis in Bangladesh. Bangladesh was on the verge of coming out of LDC status, but I think now with the political upheavals, their economy has had a setback. So I'm not certain that in 2026 they will come out of LDC status. In any case, if they were to come out of LDC status, they will lose many of their export GSP benefits to developed markets, and their exports will lose their competitive edge. Mostly when there are elections held in neighboring countries, being anti-Indian is a big vote catcher. Being anti-American or anti-Chinese is not a vote catcher. So bashing India always gets so today in Bangladesh, for instance, the Jamaat is anti-Indian, the students are anti-Indian, even the BNP is anti-Indian. After elections, we will see. It will take them about a year to keep shouting. Then when the crisis will hit them, then they will say, oh, where's Big Brother India? The other thing is that we need extreme patience and not get riled into taking knee-jerk reaction. Some people say closing the embassy when Taliban took over was a knee-jerk reaction. But I think we were more apprehensive of the security of our offices. But then if you had stayed on, perhaps this opening with Taliban would have happened earlier. No, later we were doing it in Dubai and Qatar and all that. But I think it's back on even keel. We have opened an embassy, no ambassador. But we are carrying on our projects which are actually helping the people. The Taliban want us to continue with the cancer hospital, Indira Gandhi hospital, children's hospital, the power lines, the dam which give you water for agriculture. So all these are not political. The same in Nepal and Bhutan. The amount of work we have done over 70 years to build their infrastructure. Today, both these countries, their budgets are balanced by the power produced by them from Indian funded power plants to India, and we pay them for the power. That is what balances their budget. So this kind of connectivity, this kind of support, opening market access, like Sri Lanka benefits from market access, is big. But you cannot beat the clock of anti-Indianism, because some people say if a government becomes too close to India, it leads to their defeat in the next election. So all government need to be wary of us. Yet, as I said earlier, all we want is don't threaten my security, don't shelter anti-Indian elements, and give us a level playing field. After that, you want to deal with China, America, and the off you do. We don't care.
Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Last question from my side. You also emphasize that India kept supplying power, coal, and petroleum to Bangladesh even during political uncertainty, and also prioritized stability and connectivity. So, what were the concrete risks that India accepted by doing this? And what were the strategic gains India expected in return?
Well, supposing there in Bihar there is or Jharkhand, I think there is a power plant privately run in India whose power entirely goes to Bangladesh through transmission lines. And for the last 1 year, Bangladesh has not paid its bills. So commercially, that company could have cut off the power, no? The consequence would have been that while commercially they were justified, to the Bangladesh people, this would have seemed like Indian coercion. They wouldn't have seen that they had defaulted commercially. They would say, no, the Indians are trying to fix us. The same, we have a pipeline which provides diesel and other stuff into Bangladesh. If we had shut that down, it would have created huge problems on fuel in Bangladesh. So the people would then hold you responsible without looking at the commercial aspects. So that is the risk that we take. We don't want to alienate the people, even if it has commercial risk. And then Indian companies have to work with the government to find ways to subsidize that risk.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh.
And thank you all for patiently listening to me. Thank you, Kamakshi. Thank you very much. And good wishes to all of you in what you do ahead.
So thank you so much. As we come to the close of today's session, I would like to sincerely thank Ambassador Gurjit Singh for an insightful and enriching lecture. His remarks helped us move beyond broad headlines and better understand the strategic thinking and practical choices that shape India's foreign policy in a rapidly evolving multipolar world. And I think today's discussion also highlighted some key takeaways for us as students of diplomacy and strategy. First, that India's external engagement is increasingly defined by clarity of national interest and flexibility in partnerships. Second, that issue-based cooperation across security, technology, connectivity, climate, and global governance is becoming essential in a more fragmented international system. And third, that navigating this transition, it requires both strategic patience and diplomatic agility. The themes we explored today, from shifting alignments and great power competition to regional agency and institutional reforms, they speak directly to the real-world challenges policymakers face today. And they also remind us that effective diplomacy demands nuance, like we have to be nuanced in our approach. We should look after credibility, and we also should have a strong understanding of the global context. On the behalf of the Tillotoma Foundation, I once again thank Ambassador Singh for sharing his experience and perspective, and I thank all of you for your active participation and thoughtful questions. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much.